Ashevale Gulch sat at the base of the Ruby Mountains like something the landscape had forgotten to finish. The town existed because silver had been found in the rock above it 17 years ago, and it persisted now on copper and stubbornness, two substances that outlast beauty but never quite replace it. By October of 1887, the silver was mostly memory. The copper paid wages but not dreams, and the men who ran the town had begun the quiet project of deciding which people belonged in the picture they were painting of themselves. The air that morning carried the particular cold of high desert autumn, not the killing cold of what was coming, but its older brother, the cold, that walks ahead of catastrophe and leaves doors open. Maren Ashby felt it through the thin wool of her coat as she crossed the main street toward the town hall, a single-story building that smelled permanently of pine resin and the tobacco of men who believed their opinions carried the weight of law. She was 17, though she moved with the deliberateness of someone who had been 30 for a long time. Her hands were the giveaway rough-palmed, the knuckles thickened from 2 years of work that her father had done before her, and that she had simply absorbed into herself the way stone absorbs heat, slowly, completely, without complaint. She carried a folded paper in her left hand. Her mother had pressed it into her fingers that morning with the particular urgency of a woman who cannot read the language of the country she lives in and has learned to trust what little she can recognize the word sign written in the margin underlined twice by the clerk who had delivered it. Maren had read the full document in the light of their single remaining candle while her mother slept. She understood what it was. She had not told Hilda. The town hall filled the way these things always fill in small places with people who had heard there was something to see. The 5 council members arranged themselves behind the long table like men who have practiced looking serious. Judge Harlan Stoke occupied the center chair with the physical authority of a man who has never been told to sit somewhere else. He was large in the soft way of men whose prosperity insulates them from effort, and he wore a watch chain that caught the light with every shift of his considerable weight, as though even his accessories had been trained to remind observers of his standing. Maren stood beside her mother at the front of the room. Hilda Ashby was 44 years old, which looked like more when you stood next to her in a room full of people who had decided to stop seeing you. She had come from a small Moravian settlement in Pennsylvania 20 years ago, following her husband west, the way women of her generation followed their husbands, with faith that the destination would prove worth the distance. Her English had never fully shed the architecture of German, the vowels shaped slightly differently, the sentences constructed with a precision that struck English speakers as foreignness rather than care. Shopkeepers spoke to her slowly. Children sometimes laughed. She had long ago stopped expecting either to change. The cough had taken root in her lungs the winter after Owen died. It was not a dramatic cough, not the theatrical rattle of stage consumption. It was quieter than that, a dry, persistent sound that came from somewhere deep, as though the tissue itself were slowly forgetting how to be easy, and it colored every room they entered with the particular sadness of sound that cannot be stopped. Stoke cleared his throat and the room settled. He used her first name, which was deliberate, the kind of deliberateness that men with power practice until it looks casual. He said the board had reviewed their situation. He said the cabin on charter land was needed. He used that word, needed not wanted, for the incoming assayer, a position of some importance to the town's future. He spoke of the future with the confidence of a man who expects to be present for it. From her position at the front of the room, Maren could see the door. A young man stood just inside it, perhaps 22, in a coat that still held its shape, watching the back of Stokes' head with the patient attention of someone who already knows the outcome. When the judge mentioned the cabin, the young man's mouth moved in something too small to be a smile but too intentional to be anything else. Stoke gestured toward the map on the wall. The board, he explained with the solemn generosity of a man distributing gifts he doesn't value, had deeded them a plot. 3 acres at the eastern edge of the charter boundary. Free of all encumbrance, he said, as though the absence of debt were the same as the presence of worth. Hilda's voice, when she found it, was very quiet. "Where will we go?" The words seemed to shrink in the masculine air of the room, to reduce themselves to something the walls could absorb without having to respond to. Maren already knew the answer. Everyone in Ashevale Gulch knew the notch. It was a piece of land that had been discussed and dismissed so many times, the dismissal had become a kind of local geography as reliable as the mountains. It sat on a north-facing slope of loose scree and wind-racked juniper above the main gulch, useless for grazing, useless for farming, too exposed for any structure a reasonable man would trust through a Nevada winter. Its one feature of note was a fissure in the rock about two-thirds of the way up the slope, a dark opening roughly 10 feet wide that local children called Bear's Mouth, though no bear had found it worth inhabiting. The rock around it was ancient and dark, and the opening exhaled cold air in summer, like a thing that had swallowed winter and couldn't quite digest it. She took the deed from Stokes' extended hand without letting her fingers linger near his. The paper was heavy stock official, stamped with the seal of the county recorder. She looked at the small square marked in pencil on the attached map and felt something cold move through her that was not the autumn air. The cold of understanding arriving before you are ready for it. In the back corner of the room on the long bench that ran the length of the wall, a man sat who had not moved since the meeting began. Walt Purdy was 65 years old and had spent 30 of those years underground, first in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, then copper out here, until his knees had retired him 2 years before Owen's death. He lived alone in a cabin at the north edge of town. He attended these meetings with the reliability of weather, and people treated him with similar acknowledgement. They knew he was there without particularly registering it. When Stoke had said the words, the notch something had happened to Walt Purdy's face. Not much. A small shifting the way an old wall shifts when something deep in its foundation moves. His eyes had opened fully for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to find Maren across the room with a precision that had nothing casual about it, and then they had closed again. Maren walked past his bench on her way to the door. She was thinking about the paper in her hand, about the small square on the map about mid-November, and the mathematics of survival in an exposed location with a sick woman and no money and no wood. She was not thinking about Walt Purdy. His voice reached her when she was 2 steps from the door, low enough that only she could have caught it, shaped with the particular compression of a man spending words he cannot afford to waste. Your father knew that place. She stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe, the wood rough under her palm. She turned, but Walt Purdy's hat was already down over his face, his chest rising in the slow rhythm of a man who has been asleep for some time. By the time she had fully turned, he was standing, moving toward the back exit with the unhurried shuffle of age, and then the gray light of the doorway took him, and he was gone. She stood for a moment longer than she should have, holding the deed, holding the question. His words had opened in her like a seam in rock. Outside, the cold had sharpened. She found her mother on the steps. Hilda's shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, her eyes holding the specific quality of a woman who has hoped for something for a long time and has just watched the last of it leave through a door she cannot follow. Clem Rigby was waiting across the street. He was leaning against the post of his father's general store with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had arranged himself to look like he happened to be there. He was 19 tall without being substantial, with a face that was almost settled into its final arrangement, but not quite as though the bones beneath it were still negotiating. He had his father's coloring and his father's calculating quality, which the father wore as a survival tool, and the son had converted into something more personal. His mother had died when he was 9. Everyone in Asheville Gulch knew this, the way they knew other established facts, the elevation of the pass, the depth of the main shaft. She had gone the way lungs go in mining towns by degrees, the cough becoming the constant, then the crisis, then the absence. His father, Walter Rigby, had never spoken of her afterward, had folded that chapter of his life with the efficiency of a man who has learned that grief is a luxury the practical cannot afford. What he had given his son instead was a single operating principle. In this town, you are either useful or you are invisible. Clem had spent 10 years learning to be useful. He stocked the shelves, extended credit to men his father trusted, delivered goods in weather that kept everyone else indoors, remembered the names of children and the preferences of wives. In return, people acknowledged him. They said his name when they entered the store. It was not warmth, but it was the shape of warmth, and he had mistaken it for the thing itself long enough that he was no longer certain of the difference. He had noticed Maren Ashby the way you notice a fire on a distant ridge from safety, with a particular combination of fascination and unease that attaches itself to things that seem to require nothing from you. She did not lower her eyes when men spoke to her. She did not arrange her face into the expressions of agreeableness that made other women easier to be around. She moved through spaces with a self-possession that struck him as both magnetic and slightly insulting, because it implied she had already measured the room and found it unnecessary. His voice carried across the street with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to pitch words to be heard. I heard about the council's decision. He stepped off the porch. Listen, my father has a room behind the store. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. You could stay there, work the counter a few hours each day to cover the cost. He said it with the smile of someone offering rescue. Fair deal for everyone. Maren looked at him for 1 second the way she looked at things she was assessing rather than things she was greeting. No, she did not explain. She did not thank him for the offer. She did not soften the refusal with any of the social machinery that refusals usually come equipped with. She said the word the way you close a door, completely without drama, without leaving a gap for renegotiation. Something happened in the space behind Clem Rigby's eyes. The smile remained on his face the way a flag remains flying after the reason for flying. It has passed. Pride doesn't keep you warm, he said, but she was already walking Hilda at her side, the two of them moving up the main street, with the unhurried purpose of people who have somewhere to be. He watched them go. He did not look away. The walk to their cabin took 20 minutes on the road that climbed out of the gulch's shallow valley. Maren held her mother's arm on the loose gravel section, steadying her when the cough came. It came twice, hard and dry, and each time Hilda pressed her free hand against her sternum as though she could hold the sound inside through will alone. They did not speak much. The silence between them was not the silence of comfort, but the silence of two people carrying the same weight in different ways, each unwilling to set it down and make the other watch. Maren's mind was doing something she did not choose. It was pulling her backward the way grief pulls, not with force, but with the particular gravity of things that are not finished. She was 14 again, following her father down into the earth. Owen Ashby had been a man assembled from the Welsh valleys, compact, deliberate, with hands that had developed the specific intelligence of hands that have spent decades reading rock. He had come to Nevada 12 years before Maren's birth, following the same westward logic that brought thousands of mining men from the exhausted seams of the old world to the promise of the new one. He had a gift for geology that went beyond training into something closer to intuition, the ability to read pressure lines and thermal gradients, the way a doctor reads a face to understand what the stone was telling him through its color and texture, and the specific way it fractured under a chisel. On the day she remembered he had taken her down to 200 feet, the shaft descended on a steep angle timbered with lodgepole beams that creaked under the mountain's weight in a language that experienced miners learned to interpret. As they descended, the air changed. It grew warmer, which had seemed wrong to her. She had expected the earth to be cold at its center, the way cellars are cold, the way caves are cold. Owen stopped at 200 feet. He turned off his lamp. The darkness was the kind that has weight. It pressed against her eyelids, against the surface of her eyes, so complete that the difference between having them open or shut was nothing at all. She felt the urge to reach for something solid and resisted it. "Don't listen with your ears," Owen said, and his voice in the Welsh English he had carried from Swansea had a quality that made ordinary sentences sound like they deserved attention. "Listen with your skin." She listened, not with her ears because there was nothing to hear. The mine was briefly still. The pumps paused, the other miners distant. She listened with her arms, her face the back of her neck. The warmth came to her slowly, the way understanding comes when you stop trying to force it. A gentle, patient radiance from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. Not the sharp heat of combustion, something older and more reliable. The earth was warm here at depth, with the slow constancy of a thing that stores energy over geological time and releases it without hurry. Owen lit his lamp. His eyes held the specific brightness of a man who is about to say something he has been thinking about for years. Down here, a few meters below the surface, the temperature barely changes. Summer or winter doesn't matter. Up there, he made a gesture toward the distant roof of the world above them. The surface is a liar, Maren. It screams with heat in July and screams with cold in January. But down here, the earth tells one story all year. One constant story. He paused. His hand went to the wall beside him. Fingers spread against the rock, eyes going somewhere interior the way they did when he was working towards something he wasn't ready to fully articulate. "That piece of land north of town," he said. "The one with the fissure in the rock, the place they call the Notch." He had a small private smile, then the smile of a man who has seen something others have missed. "Everyone says it's worthless." His hand pressed flatter against the rock. "But I see what they can't." A shout echoed from deeper in the shaft. A timber brace needed resetting, the minor emergencies that constituted the rhythm of mine life. Owen turned toward the sound, already moving, already shifting back into his professional self, and the conversation ended. The way conversations end when the world interrupts them completely without resolution, as though someone had blown out the lamp on a sentence still in progress. They had never returned to it. 3 months later, the eastern shaft collapsed. Maren came back to the road to her mother's arm under her hand, to the cold that was sharpening with the afternoon. They had 1 hour of daylight left when they reached the cabin that would not be theirs after this week. The following morning, she went to see Dr. Silas Croft before she went anywhere else. His office occupied the back room of his house, which sat at the end of the residential block and smelled of carbolic acid and the particular must of a man who lives alone among his books. Croft was 60, lean in the way of men who have never found food particularly interesting, with spectacles that sat at the extreme tip of his nose, as though gravity were slowly winning a long argument with them. He was not a man who trafficked in comfort. What he offered instead was accuracy, which in a frontier settlement was worth considerably more. He had examined Hilda the previous week. He stood with Maren on his porch, now the door closed behind them, his voice at a register that did not carry. Your mother's lungs are compromised in a way that is not reversible. He delivered this the way he delivered all medical information, directly, without the cushioning that would have made it easier to hear and harder to act on. The tissue is scarred, the underlying capacity is diminished. She is not dying quickly, but the margin is narrow and conditions can narrow it further very fast. Maren's hand found the porch railing. The wood was cold. What does she need? Warm air, dry air, clean air, meaning low in particulate, low in smoke. He removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose with the precise gesture of a man performing a calculation. The critical word is consistent, not warm for 4 hours and cold for 12. Consistently warm, night included. If she spends this winter in cold and damp, in smoky conditions, she will not reach February. He replaced his spectacles. I am not speculating. I am telling you what the tissue will do under those conditions. Maren held his gaze. Is there anything else? Croft was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man deciding whether something is his to share. Your father came to see me some years before the accident. 2, perhaps 3 years before. He looked past her toward the mountains. He had questions about mine air and the lungs, specifically about whether a person could live in an underground space without respiratory damage, provided that space was properly ventilated with sufficient air exchange. He had theories. He had diagrams. A brief pause. He was not asking in a general way. He had a specific application in mind. The cold on Maren's hands was something she was distantly aware of. I told him what I knew, Croft continued, which was enough to confirm that his basic premise was sound, provided the ventilation was adequate and the combustion controlled. He seemed to have already worked out the mathematics. He turned toward his door. I believe he found his answers. The mind took him before he could build anything with them. The door closed. Maren stood on the porch with the particular weight of a revelation that has arrived late. Not surprising exactly, but heavier for having been waited for without knowing it was being waited for. Owen Ashby had not simply been a careful man who kept detailed records of his geological observations. He had been designing something. He had visited a doctor, asked specific questions, recorded the answers, worked out the mathematics of what it would require for a person with compromised lungs to live underground in safety and warmth. He had been designing it for his wife because he had known, with the diagnostic precision of a man who worked underground and felt what mine dust does to breathing over years, that her lungs would need something that no cabin in Nevada territory was equipped to provide. He had been designing her future. He had been designing it 4 years before the shaft collapsed, long enough that the design was probably complete by the time the mountain took him. The only thing it lacked was the person to build it. The walk back was an hour. Maren spent it doing mathematics of a different kind. 6 weeks to mid-November. The length of the trench she'd calculated 40 feet. The firebox inside the cave, the stone-lined passage running beneath the floor, the chimney stack at the far end emerging from the earth at sufficient distance to draw the smoke all the way through the system. The cave mouth sealed with wood and clay. The whole structure designed not to heat the air, which is what every cabin fireplace tried and failed to do efficiently, but to heat the rock, to charge the thermal mass of the earth itself, so that the floor and walls would radiate gentle, constant warmth long after the fire had been banked. The numbers were impossible. She was going to do it anyway. That evening, she told Hilda. Hilda listened in the way she listened to things she was afraid of, very still, her knitting needle silent in her lap, her eyes on her daughter's face with an attention that was more scrutiny than warmth. When Maren finished, the silence had a quality of held breath, a silence that was deciding something. "You talk like your father." Hilda's voice was quiet, the German architecture of it more pronounced when she was not performing for strangers. "Your father's way of seeing." A pause that lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. "Your father died in a mine." The words arrived with the precision of a tool finding the exact weakness in rock. Maren felt the impact in her chest, a compression that took a moment to resolve into breath. She steadied herself on the deliberate breath of it, the way Owen had taught her to steady herself when a problem appeared larger than the available tools. "This isn't a mine. It's a home. It is a hole in the ground." Hilda's voice had risen, and the rising triggered the cough, which took the argument out of her body for nearly a full minute, leaving her gray and breathless in the chair. When she could speak again, her eyes were wet with the specific tears of physical helplessness rather than grief. "I would rather die with people around me than in a dark cave alone." "You won't die. Your father promised me things too." The words lay between them in the candlelight. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wind pressed at the walls with the insistence of something that knows it will eventually be let in. When Hilda finally spoke again, her voice had the quality of a woman who has found a position she can hold. "Give me until mid-November. If the cave cannot be lived in by then, we go back to town. We accept whatever help is offered." A pause that carried the weight of significant concession. "Even the Rigby boy." Maren looked at her mother, at the genuine terror underneath the practicality. The fear of a woman who has already buried one person she loved while he was still walking around, who has been watching the things she depended on slip away from her by degrees. This was not a negotiation about engineering. It was a question about trust. Whether the voice of the dead man Hilda had loved could still be trusted to keep his family alive through the instrument of the daughter who was all that remained of him. "Mid-November," Maren said. She lay awake that night after Hilda's breathing steadied into sleep, listening to the small sounds of the cabin, the tick of cooling wood, the wind finding the gap under the door, the periodic soft percussion of her mother's cough receding and returning like a tide. She thought about the trench. 40 feet was a number she could hold in her mind and turn over examine from different angles, the way Owen had taught her to examine rock samples, not for what they looked like on the surface, but for what the structure implied about the conditions of their formation. For the first time since the plan had assembled itself in her mind with the clarity of a chemical reaction, she let herself think about what failure would look like. Not doubt exactly, something more honest than doubt. The raw acknowledgement that she was 17 years old, that the tools available to her were one dead man's pickaxe and the contents of a journal she hadn't fully read, and that the life her mother had been given to wait through mid-November, the only life there was, depended entirely on whether the physics her father had worked out in a dead man's notebook were correct. She reached for the journal in the dark and found it by memory, her fingers locating the spine on the crate that served as their nightstand. She opened it without being able to see it. Her fingers moved over the pages, feeling the raised impressions of Owen's pen strokes, the small topography of his handwriting. She could not read the words in the dark. She did not need to. She was not looking for information. She was looking for the feeling of his hands having pressed these same pages, the physical evidence that the knowledge existed somewhere outside her own insufficient certainty. She held the journal until Hilda coughed again and the tide of sound receded, and then she put it down and made herself believe. She was at the notch before full light the next morning. The path from the main road climbed steeply through the last timber before breaking into the open scree slope. In the early October morning, with frost on the loose rock that shifted under her boots like something alive and hostile, the notch looked exactly as advertised, north-facing, wind-scoured, producing nothing. The juniper trees at its edges were so wind-shaped they grew nearly horizontal, reaching away from the mountain with the posture of things that have been pushed their whole lives. The fissure in the rock was a dark mouth in the gray face of the hillside, flanked by thorny scrub that had grown into the entrance as though trying to seal it from the outside. She pushed through the scrub and stepped in. The change was immediate. The wind stopped. The air went still. It smelled of wet stone and darkness, and something she recognized from the mine, that specific cold mineral smell of earth at depth, which is different from the smell of soil and carries inside it a suggestion of permanence that surface smells do not have. The light from the entrance fell away quickly, losing its authority within a few feet. She let her eyes adjust. The cave went back perhaps 30 feet before narrowing into a crack too tight for a body to pass through. The floor was irregular fallen rock-packed earth, the accumulated debris of a space that had never been deliberately used. The ceiling was roughly 7 feet at the entrance lower toward the back. The walls were ancient smooth in places where water had worked on them over time, rough where rock had fractured and not yet been polished. She did what Owen had taught her to do in any enclosed space. She wet her finger on her tongue and held it up. The faintest movement of air crossed her skin. The cave was breathing a slow, faint exhalation from inside to outside, driven by temperature differential between the still air in the back and the colder air at the entrance. It was exactly what the journal described. She had read that section enough times that the words had become a part of her thinking the way sufficient repetition converts language into instinct. The mountain breathes. In winter, the warmer, lighter air tries to rise, but a long, gentle slope can hold it. The stone is a miser. It holds every degree. She opened the journal to the page she had memorized. The diagram showed a mine at it, a horizontal passage driven into a hillside, with a long trench running below the floor lined with flat stones sealed with clay. The hot gases from a firebox at one end traveled the full length of the passage in contact with the stone lining, surrendering their heat to the masonry before emerging from a chimney stack far from the entrance. By the time the smoke left the system, it had paid in full. What it left behind in the rock and the floor and the thermal mass of the structure was not the wasted heat of an open hearth, but stored energy that would radiate back into the space for hours after the fire went dark. She read his notation beside the diagram twice. The mountain breathes in summer and exhales in winter, and the stone remembers every degree it has ever held. A fire at the mouth is waste. A fire deep inside with a long passage between it and the sky teaches the heat where to go. She sat for a long time in the mouth of the cave with the journal in her lap, the wind outside working at the scrub while the air inside held its peculiar stillness, and she looked at this space with the specific eyes of someone who was measuring it against a plan rather than against expectations. She was not looking at a cave. She was looking at walls, floor, ceiling, footprint, the raw materials of a room. She looked at the entrance, narrow and manageable. She thought about the lumber that would be needed to frame it, not much if the structure used the rock walls to carry the load, if the door was built into the existing contour of the opening rather than against it. She thought about the glass she would need for a window small enough to be affordable position for light without sacrificing the thermal seal. She thought about the firebox she would build back from the entrance at the point where the cave's natural shape provided the most thermal mass on three sides, and about the trench that would begin there and run toward the entrance and then angle under the floor on its long journey to the distant chimney. The plan was not comfortable to contemplate. It required 40 feet of trench dug through compacted glacial till with a dead man's pickaxe. It required a chimney stack built from materials that didn't yet exist at a location she hadn't yet surveyed, sealed with clay that would have to be mixed and applied in conditions that would get steadily colder as the weeks passed. It required a front wall built from whatever wood she could find or trade for fitted against the irregular rock of the cave entrance with the precision of a good seal and no margin for error. It was an impossible amount of work for one person with no money, no help, a sick mother, a deadline, and the approaching winter of 1887. She picked up the journal, looked once more at the dark interior of the cave with the cold mineral air and the faint suggestion of thermal depth, and decided. Her lips barely moved. "I see it, Pa," she said to no one present. "I see what you saw." She walked back down the mountain into the last of the autumn light, the journal under her arm already counting the days. The tools were there when they arrived. Maren saw them from 20 feet out, arranged on a flat rock just to the left of the cave entrance, with a deliberateness that could not have been accidental. A pickaxe spare but well-maintained, the head freshly dressed. A short-handled shovel with a blade that caught the morning light. An iron chisel, the kind used for splitting rock along natural seams. Old tools, all of them worn to the specific smoothness that comes not from neglect, but from decades of correct use, the handles darkened by the oils of many working hours. Beside them, drawn on the flat surface of the rock in white chalk, an arrow pointing into the cave entrance. Next to the arrow, a number 2 degrees. Maren crouched and picked up the pickaxe. She turned it in her hands, feeling the weight distribution, noting the angle at which the head had been sharpened. The grinding technique was one she had seen exactly once before. A shallow angle, almost lazy looking to someone who didn't know what it accomplished, producing an edge that held through compacted material far longer than the steeper grind most men used. It was a technique specific to a narrow tradition Welsh mining country, passed down through generations of men who had cut coal from deep seams and had centuries to refine the small efficiencies that make brutal work survivable. She stood with the pickaxe in her hands for a moment, her shadow falling across the chalk arrow. The number 2 degrees meant something. She could feel it the way you feel the relevance of something before you understand it, a piece placed on the board before the game makes its purpose clear. She filed it away in the part of her mind that Owen had trained for exactly this, the part that holds incomplete information, without discarding it, that waits for context, the way rock waits for pressure. Hilda had come up behind her. Her mother looked at the tools, then at her daughter's face. She asked nothing. She began unpacking the handcart. They moved their possessions into the cave that first morning with the efficiency of people who have little to move. The bedrolls went against the smoothest section of wall. The food stores, potatoes, dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, 2 tins of salt pork went on a flat ledge near the back where the temperature would stay consistent. Owen's rock samples, which Hilda had refused to leave behind despite their weight, went into a wooden box that had survived 2 years of being too important to sell. Maren picked up the pickaxe and walked to the position she had marked the previous evening, with a scratch in the dirt, the spot where the firebox would be built back from the entrance with the cave's natural rock, providing 3 sides of thermal mass. She checked her line. She adjusted her stance the way Owen had shown her, weight low, the swing coming from the hips rather than the shoulders, letting the tool's momentum do the work that muscle alone could not sustain across a long day. She swung. The impact traveled up the handle and into her wrists with a force that surprised her, even though she had been expecting it. The ground did not give the way she'd hoped. The surface scraped away in the first few strikes, revealing what lay beneath glacial, till the compressed legacy of ice sheets that had moved through this valley 10,000 years ago and left behind a matrix of clay and shattered rock, so thoroughly consolidated it bore the weight of the hillside above it without strain. Each strike sent a shock through the tool, through her hands, up her arms to her shoulders. The sound it made was wrong, too solid, too resistant, the sound of material that has never been asked to move. The first inch took 20 minutes. She had 5,280 inches to go. She worked from the gray of early morning until she could no longer distinguish the trench line from the floor beside it. 12 hours, some days 14. The trench was 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, 40 feet long, running from the firebox position toward the entrance, where it would angle beneath the future floor on its course toward the chimney stack she would build at the far end of the slope. She measured progress by a unit Owen had used without naming it, body lengths. Her own. 1 Maren length per day if the ground cooperated. Half that when she struck a buried seam of granite. Hilda worked beside her when her breath permitted, which was less each day as the October air sharpened. She was not helpless, far from it. She mixed the clay and water into the thick paste that would seal the flue stones, working the heavy slurry with thin arms that trembled at the effort but did not stop. She went down the slope to the scree field each afternoon to gather flat stones, selecting each one, the way a careful cook selects produce, feeling for weight and thickness, rejecting any that would not sit flush against its neighbor. It was invisible labor in the way all foundational labor is invisible. Not dramatic, not the work that stories remember, but the work without which nothing stands. On the 3rd day, the character of the ground changed. Maren felt it through the handle before she heard it. The impact had been producing a particular dull thud for 3 days, the sound of resistance without resonance. Then the pickaxe went through a layer of compacted gravel and struck something that rang a cleaner sound, almost like a bell note, a sound with some life in it. She knelt and brushed the debris away with her palm. Red sandstone layered with thin, dark bands of shale. The 2 materials alternated in precise horizontal strata, thin as the pages of a book, the red and black recurring with the consistency of a pattern rather than the randomness of geological accident. She knew this rock. Not from having seen it here, she had never dug this deep on this hillside, but from the wooden box against the cave wall. Owen's samples. One of them labeled in his careful hand was this exact composite. His notation read slow, thermal conductivity, high retention, sustains heat release over extended periods. Excellent for masonry applications requiring consistent temperature output. He had surveyed this hillside, not just walked across it, not just noted the cave's existence. He had dug. He had taken samples. He had identified the specific geological composition of the rock that lay beneath the surface of the notch and had recorded it against the day when someone would need to know what was there. She sat back on her heels and held the piece of sandstone. It was warm from the friction of the chisel, an irony she registered without amusement. She set it aside with a care that was slightly more than functional, then picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. Judge Stoke arrived on the fifth morning on his bay horse, coming up the slope at a comfortable pace that communicated he was not being inconvenienced by this errand. He sat in the saddle for a full minute, looking at the scene without speaking. The growing trench, the piles of excavated material, the cave entrance with the bedrolls visible inside it, Maren standing waist-deep in the excavation with the pickaxe still moving. She did not stop working when his shadow crossed her. She felt it, the change in the quality of light, the particular silence of a man waiting to be acknowledged. She kept swinging. "What in God's name is this?" The bewilderment in his voice was genuine. Men of Stoke's position are not often genuinely bewildered, and the sound of it was almost refreshing. Maren let the pickaxe rest. She looked up at him from the trench, and the angle put her at a disadvantage in height, but not in anything else. "Our hearth." He stared at the trench. He stared at the cave. His horse shifted under him, the leather creaking. "I should tell you, Miss Ashby, that the board retains certain rights regarding structures built on deeded land. If anything you build here constitutes a fire hazard or a collapse risk." "Understood." He waited. He was accustomed to people filling silences he left open. Maren did not fill it. After a moment, he turned the horse back toward town, his posture carrying the particular dignity of a man who has done his duty without quite achieving the effect he intended. The story he carried back with him spread through Ashfell Gulch with the speed of news that confirms what people already suspected. The Ashby girl, the one who had turned down the Rigby boy's offer, the one who had said nothing in the council meeting when she should have pleaded, was up on the notch digging some kind of underground trench. A ditch 40 feet long lined with stones. Her sick mother working beside her. They were going to live in the cave. They were going to try to heat it with some contraption no one could quite describe to anyone else's satisfaction. Ashby's folly. Someone called it a phrase that moved through the saloons with the particular pleasure that attaches to the failures of people who have refused help. Helen Bowman came on the fifth afternoon, not to the cave, but to the creek below it. Maren had come down to fill the water bucket, her arms aching in the specific way that makes the descent of a slope feel like a different kind of labor than the ascent. Helen was standing on the far bank with a cloth-wrapped bundle pressed against her midsection, looking like a woman who has made a decision she hasn't fully committed to yet. She held the bundle out across the water. Wool yarn, a tin of lard, half a loaf of bread from that morning. Her words came quickly with the rhythm of a rehearsed speech whose speaker is afraid of interruption. "Ezra doesn't know I'm here. He thinks what you're doing is dangerous. He would not approve of this." Maren looked at the bundle. Her first impulse was what it always was. Now the clean refusal, the maintenance of the wall she had built around herself since Owen's death, brick by brick with the mortar of self-sufficiency. Accepting help had a cost. She understood precisely. It created the obligation to need, and needing created the opening through which everything else could enter. She thought of Hilda's shawl, thin as a prayer, inadequate for what was coming. She took the bundle. Helen's face relaxed in the way faces relax when they have been braced against rejection. "I watch from my kitchen window every morning." A pause. "I've never seen anyone work like that. Not even the men from the mine." She turned to go, then stopped. "Whatever you're building, I hope it works." She moved back through the trees quickly, a woman returning to the shape of her life before it noticed her absence. Maren stood at the creek, holding the bundle, and experienced something she had not expected. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated, the small destabilizing shock of being seen without being asked for anything in return. It moved through her like the first sign of thaw, not the thaw itself, not the breaking open, but the moment when what has been frozen registers the change in pressure and shifts. She carried the bundle up the slope. Ezra Bowman came on the seventh day. He came on foot, which was itself a statement about the seriousness of his intentions, leading a mule whose cart carried fresh-cut Douglas fir, straight-grained seasoned lumber enough to frame a tight lean-to against the south-facing rock above the cave entrance. He had split it himself. The cuts were precise, the lengths uniform, the work of a man who has been building things for 30 years with the same standard of accuracy. He found Maren fitting capstones on the first completed section of the flue. She was on her knees in the trench, placing flat sandstone pieces with the patience of someone who understands that the integrity of the whole depends on the integrity of each joint. Her hands were dark with clay. She had the stillness of a person who has entered the repetitive focus of physical work and gone somewhere interior that the body can reach and the mind cannot. Ezra removed his hat. He was 52, built like the structures he built, solid, load-bearing, designed to last. He had constructed the town hall, the church, both school buildings, the mill, the assay office, 20-some cabins, the stable at the north end of town. Every significant structure in Asheville Gulch had his handprints somewhere in its walls. He was proud of this in the way craftsmen who have served their community well have a right to be proud with evidence. He explained what he had brought. He explained where he would build the lean-to south-facing, catching what winter sun the mountains permitted. He explained the fireplace he could build, stone and mortar, a proper vertical chimney. His voice carried the patient authority of a man who knows what he's talking about. Maren listened to every word. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for the offer. It is generous." She paused. "But the ground will not steal the heat. It will hold it." Ezra's patience with this was genuine. "The ground is a thief, Miss Ashby. I've built in this country my whole life. The cold comes up through the floor, first kills the warmth before the walls can catch up. A horizontal flue 40 feet long hasn't got the draw a vertical chimney has. Your smoke won't pull. You'll fill that cave inside an hour." He leaned forward slightly. "I carried a little girl out of a cave in the next valley winter of '79. Family tried what you're trying. Built a fire inside without a proper chimney. The smoke couldn't go anywhere." His voice dropped into a register that had nothing to do with professional opinion. "She was the same age as my Nell. I had her in my arms for 200 yards of snow before I found somewhere to set her down." The story arrived with the weight of genuine experience. Maren did not dismiss it. She looked at Ezra with the full attention she gave to things that needed to be understood before they could be responded to. "Watch," she said. She moved to the firebox she had rough built at the beginning of the trench, a temporary structure of stacked stone adequate for demonstration. She struck a match, held it to a handful of dry juniper needles arranged in the stone bowl, waited for them to catch. They did. The smoke curled up from the small fire, reaching for the open air, the way smoke always reaches. Then it stopped reaching. Something changed in the way the air moved inside the firebox. The smoke bent, hesitated, and then moved downward into the throat of the trench, with a sound, a low, resonant pull like a breath drawn by something very large. It disappeared into the earth. They both watched the empty space where the smoke had been. "That's the wind from outside," Ezra said, but there was something slightly different in his voice now, a quality that was not quite certainty. "There's no wind inside the cave. The temperature at the chimney end is colder than the temperature at the firebox. Cold air is denser. It falls, it pulls the hot air behind it through the passage." Maren's voice held no triumph. She was stating physics. "By the time the smoke reaches the chimney, it's surrendered most of its heat to the stone. What comes out the top is barely visible. The heat that stayed behind is in the floor." Ezra looked at the trench. He looked at the cave entrance. He looked at her. The silence between them was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, each with solid ground under their feet, neither able to see the other's footing from where they stand. "That's a theory," he said finally. "You are staking your mother's life on a theory. I'm staking her life on physics." He held her gaze for a long time, searching for something, doubt perhaps, or the particular quality of uncertainty that can be reasoned with. He found neither. He put his hat back on. He left the lumber on the ground. "I wish you well, Miss Ashby." The words carried the formal compassion of a eulogy spoken for someone still standing. He walked back down the slope. Maren watched him go, then looked at the lumber. She would use it. Not for the lean-to he had imagined, but to seal the cave entrance, the application for which it was actually suited, the purpose for which its straightness and its seasoning, and Ezra Bowman's 30 years of precision, would serve exactly as well here as it would have served in any other structure he had ever built. Hilda had heard everything from inside the cave. She emerged now, her shawl wrapped tight, looking at the pile of lumber. Her expression was the expression of a woman who loves her daughter enough to be frightened for her, which is different from any other kind of fear. "Perhaps the wood for the lean-to," she said, "just in case." Maren met her mother's eyes. She saw the genuine terror there, the specific terror of a woman who has already watched one person she trusted walk toward what killed him. "I'll use the wood," she said, "for the cave mouth." Hilda closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had resolved in her face, not confidence, but the decision to trust, which is sometimes indistinguishable from the decision to pray. She nodded once. She went back inside to mix more clay. The chimney stack took 2 full days. It rose at the far end of the trench line, the terminus of the system built from the same red sandstone that lined the flue below. She set each stone with the clay mortar mixture Owen's journal specified, tapping each piece into place with a small hammer, checking the joints with her fingers, feeling for gaps, the way the journal described feeling for gaps, not visually, because the human eye is satisfied by surfaces, but tactilely because the hand knows what the eye overlooks. She worked late on the second evening, finishing in the last of the light, checking the stack's alignment against the sky. It rose 3 feet above the surrounding ground at the distance from the cave entrance that the thermal calculations required. She stood back, looked at it, felt the particular satisfaction of a completed thing. 3 weeks into the work, Clem Rigby came in the dark. She did not know he was there until morning. She woke to the cave's silence, the usual sounds of early light absent in some way she registered before she was fully conscious. She went out. The chimney stack was rubble. Not collapsed, destroyed. Stones scattered. Clay joints cracked and separated. The careful geometry of 2 days' work reduced to a pile that occupied the same position with none of the structure. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides. The trembling started in her chest and moved outward. Not cold. Rage arriving in a form so complete it left no room for any other sensation. She looked at the ground around the ruins. Boot prints pressed deep into the soft earth beside the stack large, and deliberately placed the tread pattern she had seen on the floor of Rigby's general store when she had gone in to compare prices on wire. A broken bottle lay in the scrub to the left. The remaining whiskey had soaked into the ground, darkening the soil in a rough circle. Hilda came out of the cave and stood behind her. "Who did this?" Maren picked up the pickaxe. She began clearing the rubble, setting each stone in a pile, separating the ones that could be reused from the ones the fall had cracked. She worked in silence for an hour before the pile was clear and the foundation exposed. Then she put the pickaxe down, changed her coat for the one that looked less like construction, and walked down the slope into town. The bell above the door of Rigby's general store made its small sound when she pushed through it. Clem was behind the counter sorting nails, and he looked up with the specific alertness of a man who has been expecting a particular moment and is still not fully prepared for it when it arrives. His face arranged itself quickly, but not quickly enough. She saw what it looked like in the half-second before the arrangement completed. "I need wire and hinges." Her voice was level. Not controlled level, which is different. Controlled is an effort. Level is what happens when the effort has been made long enough that it becomes the natural state. "I'll pay with labor. 1 day in your stockroom." The nails in his hand had stopped moving. "I thought you didn't need anyone." "I don't need charity." She held his gaze. "I'm buying supplies." He said nothing else. He measured the wire. He took the hinges from the shelf. He did not ask what they were for. She did not tell him. The transaction was completed with the clean efficiency of commerce between people who understand what is actually being exchanged. She spent the following day in the Rigby storeroom. 8 hours of organization, the shelves reduced to order, the inventory counted and recorded in the ledger that Walter Rigby kept in a system that was functional but inefficient. She worked with the same focused quiet she brought to the trench, and Clem watched from the front of the store without the language to name what was happening to him. She had seen what he had done. She knew why. She had decided he was not worth the energy of her anger. The understanding of that arriving not as statement, but as action, as the simple presence of a person going about her work in his space, without requiring anything of him, except the labor she had contracted for, undid something in him that cruelty could not have touched. She never mentioned the chimney stack. She never looked at him with the eyes of a person who knows something they could use. She rebuilt the stack in 2 days. This time she dug it lower, setting the foundation stones in a narrow trench below grade, burying the base so that the system's terminal point was anchored below the frost line. She placed heavy rocks around the exterior, not stacked but settled, fitted against each other at angles that made the structure resistant to lateral force. The stack that rose above the ground was lower than the first one, But the total construction, the buried base, the fitted surround, the sealed joints, was 3 times as difficult to damage. She also extended the ventilation at the rear of the cave. Owen's journal mentioned it in a notation she had passed over twice before its significance registered a natural fissure at the back of the cave marked with his small symbol for air exchange, with a notation about flow rate and the number of occupants a space this size could support with controlled combustion and adequate exchange. She had been treating the cave as sealed. Owen had intended it as a breathing system, warm air gently cycling through, not a static sealed space, but a managed exchange that would keep the air clean regardless of how many people occupied it. She chiseled the rear fissure open by a careful amount, testing the flow with a wisp of smoke from a small fire. The current was steady, reliable, exactly what the journal predicted. The cave exhaled. She recorded the measurement in the margin of Owen's page beside his notation in her own handwriting. October became November with a sharpness that announced itself through the quality of the mornings rather than through any dramatic event. The air stopped apologizing for being cold. The frost on the loose rock outside the cave entrance became a permanent presence rather than a temporary one, lingering through the day and merely thickening overnight. Maren was 12 days from the mid-November deadline when she struck the wet gravel. The pickaxe went through the compacted floor of the last section of trench and into something that moved differently. Loose, saturated material that had been holding water for a long time in a pocket she had not known existed. Within the first hour, 2 inches of groundwater stood in the bottom of the trench. Clear, cold, arriving with the patient persistence of something that has always been there and has merely been given permission to appear. She stared at it. The water was not deep. It was not a flood. But if it pooled in the completed flue, the hot gases moving through would generate steam rather than conducting their heat into the stone. The thermal transfer, the entire principle on which the system depended, the mechanism her father had designed, and she had spent 6 weeks building, would fail. Every foot of the 38 feet she had already completed would become decoration. The floor would radiate cold instead of warmth. Her mother would not see February. She sat in the trench with the cold water around her ankles and her hands on her knees and felt the architecture of her determination begin to show its seams for the first time. She had accounted for hard ground. She had accounted for sabotage. She had not accounted for this because the earth, which she had trusted as the fundamental material of the plan, had chosen this moment to introduce a variable her father had not mentioned. Or had he? The thought arrived before she could stop it. Had he mentioned it somewhere in the journal she had read and reread in sections she had passed through, too quickly focused on what she needed, rather than what might eventually need her? She climbed out of the trench. Her boots were soaked through. She went inside the cave to the wooden box where the journal lived and began reading from the beginning. She found the page near the back. It was one of the pages she had glanced at in the dark on the first night, the page with the ink that had blurred, that she had touched with her fingers and set aside because she could not read it without light. In the days that followed, she had not returned to it. It had seemed like supplementary material, and she had been focused on the primary calculations. She carried it to this cave entrance now, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle. She tilted the page so the light raked across it. The shallow impressions of Owen's pen pressed into the paper, even where the ink had run, became briefly legible ghost letters raised by the oblique light into visibility. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. 2 degrees, the number chalked on the rock beside the tools that had been waiting for them on their first morning. The number she had written off as a structural annotation, perhaps relating to the angle of the firebox, perhaps relating to the chimney's relationship to the horizontal. Walt Purdy had known. He had read this page, or had heard Owen describe it, or had worked beside him in a mine where this problem had arisen and this solution had been arrived at. He had come before them to leave a warning that would only make sense when they needed it. Owen had faced this in the mines, horizontal passages filled with seeping groundwater. The solution was not pumps, not drainage tiles, not any of the engineering solutions that required materials she did not have. The solution was the same principle that governed everything else in the system: work with the Earth's nature rather than against it. Grade the floor at a slight downward slope barely perceptible to the eye, sufficient for gravity to carry the water continuously toward the chimney end rather than allowing it to pool. 2 degrees. Not enough to affect the thermal calculations. Enough to mean the difference between a floor that held water and a floor that drained it. She spent the next 2 days reopening sealed sections of the trench, relaying the floor grade to a consistent 2-degree slope from the firebox toward the chimney end, cutting a narrow drainage channel along the low side to carry the seep away from the stone lining. It was the worst physical labor she had done in 6 weeks reopening work. She had sealed, correcting her own earlier calculations, working in sections of trench that were partially flooded and increasingly cold as November deepened around her. She had made a mistake, not a catastrophic one, not one that Owen's journal could not correct, but a mistake that was hers alone, arrived at through insufficient attention to a page she had passed too quickly and corrected now through the specific labor of reworking what had been wrong. When she finished, the water drained. The trench floor was dry. The system was intact. That evening alone outside the sealed cave in the last gray light, the drainage working the chimney complete the front wall framing. Nearly done, she sat on a rock and wept. It came without warning, the way the structural failures come in rock under sustained pressure, not gradually but all at once when the last grain of resistance gives. She did not cry from fear or sorrow. She cried from a tiredness so deep it had dissolved the boundary between her will and her body, leaving nothing to hold the feeling back. "I'm so tired, Pa," she said to the mountain, to the cooling air, to wherever Owen Ashby was, if he was anywhere at all. Hilda heard. She came out of the cave slowly wrapped in her shawl and sat beside her daughter on the cold ground. She did not offer words of comfort. She did not suggest that things would look different in the morning. She simply sat, her shoulder against Maren's shoulder, her warmth available without condition. After a long while, she spoke. "Your father used to sit on the back step after his shifts, face in his hands. I pretended not to see." A pause that held the tenderness of old memory. Every morning, he went back into that mine, not because he wasn't afraid, because some things matter more than being afraid. Maren did not answer. She did not need to. She needed only to know that the man who had designed the system, whose mathematics she was staking everything on, had also known this feeling. The breaking point, the exhaustion that goes past the body into something more essential, and had gotten up the following morning and gone back into the earth anyway. The first star appeared, then two. The cold settled fully around them, definitive, the cold of a Nevada night in November with nothing between the sky and the skin but wool. Maren stood up. She went back inside. She added wood to the firebox. On the 2nd of November, 13 days before the deadline, she drove the last nail into the front wall's framing, fitted the door into its frame with the hinges from Rigby's store, and pressed the final clay packing into the gap between the wall and the cave rock. She stepped back. The cave entrance was sealed, a solid wooden wall occupying the full width of the opening, with a door that swung true on its hinges, a small window fitted with a pane of glass. She had traded Hilda's silver locket for it at Croft's office, where the doctor had accepted it without discussion and produced the glass with the practicality of a man who understands what is actually needed. Helen Bowman came a second time with her daughter Nell, whose brown curls and caring voice filled the hillside in the way children's voices do, loudly without apology. Nell watched Maren stuff the final moss and clay packing into the gaps and asked with the devastating directness of a 7-year-old, "Do you live in a cave like a bear?" Something in Maren's chest loosened. The laugh that came out surprised her. It felt like something returning from a long absence. Not a laugh she performed, but one that arrived unbidden. "Warmer than a bear," she said. Helen worked beside her for 2 hours, quick and competent. Before leaving, she said something quietly, not looking at Maren, but at the sealed wall. "Thomas has been different since he came back from here. He doesn't say anything, but he's been drawing things, sketches of his own buildings, looking at the floors." A brief pause. "I think you worried him more than he wants to admit." She took Nell's hand and started down the slope. Maren built the first real fire on the 4th of November. She laid dry juniper branches in the firebox arranged according to the journal's specifications for initial combustion, loosely enough for airflow, dense enough for sustained burn. She struck the match. The flame caught and spread with the ordinary enthusiasm of fire meeting dry wood, and for a few seconds it behaved exactly like every fire she had ever built. It rose, it brightened, it produced heat in the immediate vicinity of the fuel. Then the draw took it. The sound was the same as the small demonstration she had shown Ezra Bowman, that low, resonant pull, like the intake of breath from something much larger than either of them. The flame bent at the firebox throat. The smoke moved not upward but downward into the trench, into the stone-lined passage, beginning its 40-foot journey through the thermal mass she had spent 6 weeks building. The visible smoke at the firebox vanished within seconds. The cave air remained clear. She fed the fire carefully the way the journal specified: small amounts, frequent additions, promoting the hot, clean burn that produces heat, rather than the slow smoldering that produces smoke. She fed it for 3 hours, sitting near the firebox, watching, measuring nothing, waiting for something she could feel rather than see. 3 hours. The air in the cave was cold. The rock walls radiated their deep mineral chill. Hilda sat bundled in the bedroll with the expression of a woman who is honoring a commitment to wait. Maren put her hand on the floor near the firebox. Cold. She waited. She fed the fire. She did not think about what failure would require. It was late in the evening when she felt it. She was lying on her bedroll. The fire banked to coals, the cave quiet around her. She had her cheek near the floor, not consciously, simply because she was exhausted, and the floor was there. Something in the quality of the surface against her face had changed. She pressed her palm flat against the stone 2 feet from the firebox. The cold that should have been there, the deep radiating cold of rock in November, was absent. Not warm. Not yet. Something between cold and neutral that had no word of its own, the first degree of change, the edge of a threshold. She moved her hand along the line of the buried flue, following it toward the center of the cave. The warmth strengthened. Not the warmth of a fire, there was no fire there. The warmth of stored energy releasing itself through 15 inches of earth and stone, slow, even patient, the warmth of a thing that has been given heat and is now giving it back. She lay with her palm on the floor for a long time, feeling the cave's temperature change around her, the way a room changes when something has been decided, not abruptly, but completely, so that by the time you are certain it has happened, you cannot locate the exact moment when it began. She looked at her mother. Hilda was asleep. Her chest rose and fell in the steady, uncomplicated rhythm of a woman whose lungs were not working against the cold. No cough. The small, dry percussion that had colored their nights for 2 years was simply absent, replaced by the even sound of a body at ease. Maren lay on the warm floor of the cave her father had designed, in the mountain he had mapped, in the warmth he had calculated before she knew she would need it, and experienced the specific relief of a person who has held her breath for so long that exhaling feels for a moment indistinguishable from grief. She did not wake her mother. She did not say anything aloud. She simply lay there with her hand on the warm earth, listening to Hilda breathe, and let herself believe that the man who had designed this room had known somehow that this is exactly how it would feel when it finally worked. The 11th of January arrived wearing the wrong season. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed to 43 degrees, which was not simply warm for January in Nevada territory, but wrong in the way that a familiar face wearing an unfamiliar expression is wrong, recognizable in its components, deeply unsettling in its totality. Children who had not played outside without coats since October were playing outside without coats. Men stood in doorways of shops they had kept sealed for weeks, letting the air move through. Women opened windows to release the accumulated staleness of months of sealed living, reaching for the small domestic satisfaction of aired-out spaces. Maren stepped out of the cave into the warmth of it, stood on the ledge above the gulch, let the sun work on her face. The sky was the deep, specific blue of high desert winter, unmarked. The mountains to the west still held their snow, but the light on them was different today, less severe, almost inviting, as though the season had reconsidered. The air smelled of metal. It was not a strong smell. A person not paying attention would not have caught it. But Maren had spent 2 years reading the physical world for information it was not volunteering, developing the attention that the inattentive cannot understand, the ability to register the small signals that precede large events. The metallic quality in the air was a pressure signature. She recognized it from a passage in Owen's Mine Safety Notes, the section on barometric conditions when winter gives you a warm day. Without warning, it is not resting. It is gathering momentum. She went back inside. She checked the wood supply. She checked the door frame for any gap that might have developed in the clay packing over the past 2 months of temperature changes. She checked the chimney draw, feeling for the pull at the firebox throat that told her the system was working. She ran her hands along the accessible sections of the flue stones, pressing fingers into joints, checking for the hairline fractures that freeze-thaw cycles produce in masonry. Everything was intact. Everything was ready. She could not have said ready for what. She only knew that the readiness was necessary. That night the wind was perfectly still. The absence of sound from outside was so complete, it had a texture, a density, the kind of silence that gathers before transformation rather than after it. Hilda slept steadily, her breathing the even rhythm of lungs that had been given 3 months of warm, clean air and had used them to quietly rebuild what the mine dust had damaged. Maren lay awake for a long time looking at the stone ceiling, where a faint sheen of moisture caught the last light of the banked fire, and she listened to the silence the way Owen had taught her to listen in the dark, not with the ears, with the skin. She was still awake when the silence ended. The 12th of January, 1888, arrived at 1 o'clock in the afternoon while the temperature still stood at 43 degrees. There were children in shirt sleeves on the main street of Asheville Gulch when the northwestern horizon went black. Not gray, not the gradual darkening of ordinary storm clouds that gives a person time to complete a sentence walk inside, pour a cup of coffee. The color was absolute, a blackness that extended from the ground to the top of the visible sky, traveling across the valley floor, with the speed and the intent of something that does not need the permission of the landscape it crosses. The wind arrived before the snow did, which was how people understood later that this was categorically different from ordinary weather. Wind this strong has a physical presence. It does not push, it strikes. A man crossing the street between the hardware store and the mill was knocked off his feet and did not immediately get up. A shudder tore from the front of Rigby's general store with a sound like a rifle shot. Horses in the open lot at the north end of town felt it before it was visible and screamed in the way horses scream when they are beyond the capacity of experience to prepare them. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. Then it kept dropping. The snow that came behind the wind was not snow in any recognizable form. It was not flakes or crystals or the soft accumulating weight of ordinary winter precipitation. It arrived as a solid mass, white and opaque, that reduced visibility to the length of an arm extended and then to nothing. A person standing outside could not see their own hands. Sound became irrelevant. The wind was so continuous, so vast in its register, that it ceased to function as a sound at all. It became a condition. It became the new nature of the air. Inside Thomas Caldwell's cabin. No inside Ezra Bowman's cabin. The finest structure in Asheville Gulch, built with his own hands over the course of a summer 12 years ago. Every joint tight, every log selected for straightness. The fireplace a masterwork of stone construction that had served without complaint. Through 11 previous winters, the storm found every weakness that 30 years of craft had not eliminated. The log walls held, the roof held. The fireplace drew correctly the vertical chimney, producing the updraft that Ezra had staked his professional reputation on. But the cold came through the walls in a way that insulation cannot fully prevent, the slow infiltration of extreme temperature through the thermal mass of the logs themselves, the wood conducting the cold inward, the way it conducted everything inward over time. 10 feet from the hearth, the temperature was below freezing, despite the fire roaring at a rate that was consuming the wood supply with the efficiency of something that has decided to be done with waiting. James Bowman had been 6 years old for 3 weeks. He had been feverish since morning, a routine childhood illness, the kind that requires broth rest. Careful watching the ordinary attentiveness of parents who have managed childhood illness before. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been an inconvenience. The cold had converted it into something else. His fever was pushing upward against the cold's pressure, the body's internal furnace working against an external condition that drained heat faster than illness alone could generate it. His breathing was shallow, too fast, the sound of a small body laboring. Helen sat at the edge of his cot, with a cloth pressed to his forehead, her hands moving with the practiced quiet of a woman who has learned to keep fear out of her hands, even when it is everywhere else. Nell sat on the floor beside her brother, holding his hand with both of hers, old enough to understand that something serious was happening, young enough to believe that holding on could help. Ezra stood at the woodpile in the corner and counted. He was a man who had spent his life working in units he could measure. Board feet, cubic yards, structural loads. The mathematics of building were always concrete, always checkable. The mathematics of the woodpile were equally concrete at the current rate of consumption, which was not a rate he could reduce. Without the fire losing its contest with the cold, he had enough fuel to last through tonight. Tomorrow morning, perhaps, if the storm weakened. After that, he would begin with the furniture. After the furniture, the floorboards. After the floorboards, there was nothing left that would burn that was not also holding the house together. He looked at his wife across the room. Helen looked back at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 23 years of marriage. Not accusation, not fear exactly, but the look of a woman who has completed an arithmetic she cannot share. She had looked at the woodpile. She had looked at their son's chest rising too quickly. She had arrived at a sum that the available numbers could not satisfy. He had built this house. He had built the fireplace. He had spent 2 decades perfecting a method of construction that was at this moment inadequate to keep his children alive. In the general store, the elder Rigby's cough had changed character. It had moved deeper, become wetter, acquired the specific resonance that Clem recognized from the furthest back room of his own memory. The room he had sealed when he was 9 years old, because the thing inside it was unbearable, and remaining bearable was the only option available to a child who has nowhere else to go. He fed inventory into the pot-bellied stove. Display racks, wooden crates packing material. The stove accepted each offering with brief enthusiasm and then went on being inadequate. His father sat in the chair behind the counter where he had sat for 40 years, wrapped in everything they had, his breathing audible across the room. Clem stood at the window looking at the white wall of the storm where the street used to be, thinking about the girl on the hill. Thinking about a night 3 weeks into November when he had stood in the dark over something he had built and kicked it apart because he was 20 years old and had never learned the difference between being needed and mattering. He had felt the warmth through his boots. Standing on the buried flue, drunk on his own grievance, he had felt the heat rising from the earth beneath him, gentle, sustained, rising from 40 feet of charged stone through 15 inches of compacted ground to the soles of his feet. He had felt it and understood it and destroyed the thing above it anyway, because the warmth coming up through the ground had told him with absolute physical certainty that she did not need him, and not being needed was the only thing he had ever found truly unbearable. He looked at his father's chest rising with that wet sound. He thought about what he had done. He thought about what she had said when she walked into the store the morning after. Not the words which were about wire and hinges, but the quality of her silence about everything else, which was the silence of a person who has seen what you are capable of and has decided that responding to it would require more of her attention than you deserve. In Dr. Croft's surgery, 3 people lay on the floor. They had come in from the cold at various stages of the storm's progress in various states of exposure, their extremities showing the mottled discoloration that precedes frostbite's deeper damage. Croft worked by candlelight. The wind had found the gap between the window frame and the wall despite the rags stuffed into it, extinguishing his lamp twice before he gave it up. He had no more firewood. He had no more blankets. He had his hands and his knowledge and a bottle of laudanum he was rationing, against the likelihood that the night would produce more patience than he currently had. He thought about the cave. He thought about the afternoon in November when he had gone up to examine Hilda and had spent 2 minutes standing in the cave's entrance, unable to speak, pressing his palm against the wall, then the floor, then the wall again, mapping the warmth. The way he mapped symptoms methodically, without preconception, following the evidence wherever it led. He had told Maren her father would have been proud. He had meant it as a clinical assessment. The conditions her father had specified as necessary for Hilda's lungs were precisely what she had created. He had not fully allowed himself to register what else it meant, what it meant about the nature of the structure, about what it was capable of, about how many people it could under different circumstances hold. Inside the cave, Maren fed 3 juniper branches into the firebox. The fire accepted them the way it accepted everything now, without drama, without the competitive roaring of a fire that needs to assert itself against cold, it cannot quite defeat. The combustion was clean, complete, the small controlled burn that produces maximum heat from minimum fuel, exactly as the journal had specified. The draw pulled the hot gases down into the flue, with its low resonant sound, its long underground journey through 40 feet of charged stone, releasing the last of its thermal debt into the masonry before emerging from the distant chimney as something barely warmer than the frozen air outside. Hilda sat across the small table with her knitting. The needles moved in the steady rhythm they had held all evening, the click of them a domestic percussion that made the storm's muffled roar seem even more distant than the stone made it. The candle between them burned without movement, not the managed stillness of a flame in a room where everyone is carefully not breathing, the genuine stillness of air that has nowhere to go, because the walls around it are the mountain itself. "It sounds angry," Hilda set her attention on the needles. Maren listened to the storm. The stone and earth that enclosed them on 3 sides absorbed its energy the way the deep ocean absorbs a thrown stone completely without record. The wooden front wall, sealed with clay on every joint, did not vibrate. Yes, she said. Are you worried? The question was genuine, not rhetorical. Hilda asking her daughter for honest information the way she had always asked, with the directness of a woman who prefers accurate bad news to comfortable inaccuracy. Maren felt the floor under her feet, the warmth of it rising through the leather of her boots. She felt the cave walls around her, 3 feet of ancient rock charged with November's worth of stored energy. She felt the sealed door at her back solid on its hinges. No, she said. She meant it with her body as much as her mind. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Inside those 3 days, time did something that Maren would later find difficult to describe to anyone who had not been present for it. It did not slow down or speed up. It became lateral, moving parallel to the ordinary current of events rather than through it, so that each hour had the quality of depth rather than duration. The storm was what existed outside. Inside, they existed differently. Hilda cleaned the cave on the first full day, sweeping the stone floor with her juniper branch broom in long, careful strokes, rearranging the food stores with an attention to order that had nothing to do with practical necessity. She counted the potatoes and reported the count. She rationed the dried beans by the handful. The discipline of housekeeping in the face of catastrophe was not a coping mechanism in any clinical sense. It was a statement, the insistence that the standards of a kept home applied here exactly as they applied anywhere, that the cave was a home because she maintained it as one, that no storm could reclassify the space they occupied unless she permitted it. Maren spent the first day on maintenance she had been planning for a week. She cleared a small accumulation of ice from inside the chimney draw pipe, working carefully with an iron rod. Owen's tools had included restoring the full diameter of the passage. She checked each clay joint on the front wall from inside, pressing her fingers into the packed moss with a methodical patience, feeling for the cold draft that would indicate a gap. She found none. She added to the firebox every 3 hours exactly enough to sustain the system's equilibrium, nothing more. They ate potato soup cooked on the flat top of the firebox, which served as a cooking surface at a temperature that was ideal for slow heat rather than high flame. The soup was not remarkable. It was hot. It was sufficient. The meal had none of the anxiety of the shared meals they had eaten for 2 years in the cabin, the shadow of the empty pantry present at every bite. They had enough food. They had enough fuel. The storm outside was not their problem. On the second evening, Hilda set her knitting down and told stories about Owen. Not the careful edited versions she had offered on occasion over the past 2 years. The stories chosen for the comfort they might provide, shaped by the grief of the teller into something manageable. These were the other kind, the stories that come out when the teller is somewhere safe enough to let them come out as they actually are, sharp edges and all the whole difficult weight of a person who was loved and is gone. She told the story of the night they met at a church social in Butte, where Owen's Welsh English had been thicker than usual because he was nervous, where he had tried to ask her to dance in a language neither of them owned fluently, where they had both laughed at the same moment at the mutual inadequacy of their attempts to communicate, and had found in that shared laughter at language's limits a different kind of communication that required none of the words they were missing. She told the story of the night Maren was born during a thunderstorm that knocked out every lamp in the valley, where Owen had sat in the chair beside the bed for 12 hours without speaking, because there was nothing he could do and he could not leave. When it was over, when Maren was in his hands, those hands that Hilda always described as improbably gentle, for what they did, hands that could read rock, and somehow also hold a new person with complete care. He had wept without making any attempt to stop the tears of a man who has been terrified for 12 hours and is now safe to feel it. Then she said the things she had not said. Your father knew his lungs were failing. Hilda's voice held the quality of something that has been carried a long time and is being set down carefully. He felt it before I did. The mind dust, he understood what it was doing before the symptoms were clear to anyone else, because he had watched it happen to other men and he knew the sequence. She looked at the floor, at the warmth rising through it. He came to me one evening 4 years before the accident. He said he had been thinking about building a house, not a cabin, a house in the earth where the air would be what we needed, where the cold couldn't reach us, where the dust couldn't follow. A pause that contained an entire life. He drew me pictures. I didn't understand the pictures, but I understood his face when he drew them. Maren sat very still. He wasn't solving a problem, Hilda said. He was keeping a promise. He was trying to make sure that if the mind took him before he could be there himself, The work would exist somewhere for the person who came after him. She looked at her daughter. He knew you would know what to do with it. He trusted you with this before you were old enough to understand what he was trusting you with. Maren could not speak. The words were there, she could feel them existing somewhere in her chest. But the passage between them and the air was closed by something that was not grief exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but the weight of both, arriving at once, the full comprehension of what the journal was, what the notch was, what the past 6 weeks had been. The journal was not a technical document. It was a letter. Every calculation, every notation about thermal conductivity and flue angle and clay composition, every diagram drawn in Owen Ashby's careful hand on the pages of a leather-bound book he had kept through 11 years underground. It was a letter to the people he loved, written in the only language he trusted to carry precise information across the distance between his life and their future. The physics was the medium. The message was something that physics cannot contain, something older than science. The irreducible fact of a man who loved his family enough to design their survival before the mind took him. Maren reached across the table and held her mother's hands. They sat like that while the storm spent itself against the mountain and the floor beneath them stayed warm. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 15th. The stillness that followed had a different quality from the stillness before, not gathered, not waiting, but exhausted, the silence of a thing that has given everything it had. The temperature stood at 20 below zero. The sky was a polished steel blue, cloudless and different. The snow lay in drifts 10 feet deep in the low places, sculpted by the wind into shapes that had no relationship to the landscape beneath them. In Asheville Gulch, the cost was becoming countable. 2 people had died. An elderly man named Prentice, caught in the open between his cabin and his barn, found when the storm cleared at a point equidistant between both structures, having reached neither. A young woman named Clara Hatch, who had gone out in the storm's first hour to look for a child, who had in fact arrived safely at a neighbor's house. The child had been there the entire time, drinking warm broth while her mother died looking for her in white blindness, 20 feet from a door she could not find. The livestock losses were near total. The grain stores inadequate before the storm had been consumed by animals terrified beyond the ability to conserve. The wood situation was the immediate crisis. Every cabin, every business, every public building in Asheville Gulch had burned through its winter fuel supply in 3 days of fighting a storm that conventional heating was not designed to fight. The community was warm enough right now in the cold, clear aftermath to move. By tonight, they would not be. Judge Stoke called a meeting in the town hall, which was as cold inside as the street outside. Men stood rather than sat because the benches were conducting cold upward with the efficiency of the stone beneath them. Stoke spoke about organizing a timber party to the southern forest, and even as the words left his mouth, every face in the room performed the same calculation and arrived at the same answer. The snow was chest-deep on the open slopes. The southern forest was 6 miles. They would lose men getting there. They would lose more getting back with any load worth carrying. Ezra Bowman stood. He had not slept in 3 days. His face had the particular gauntness of a man who has been burning something interior to stay functional when the external resources ran out. His hands hung at his sides with a heaviness that had nothing to do with their weight. He was a man who had built his professional life on the certainty that he understood how to protect people from weather, and he had spent 72 hours watching that certainty fail in specific and measurable ways. Fail most critically where it mattered most in the room, where his son was fighting a fever against a fireplace that consumed wood like a debt that can never be fully paid. There is one place, he said, that may still be warm. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone in them already knows what is about to be said. Stoke spoke first. The cave. They can't have survived. The words carried the confidence of a man who has made a prediction and needs it to have been right. From the corner bench a sound. Walt Purdy had not spoken at a town meeting in 4 years. He had attended them with the consistency of weather present, as furniture acknowledged as little. When he stood, the men nearest him moved back with the involuntary reflex of people reacting to something unexpected from a source they had classified as static. Walt Purdy's voice had the roughness of long disuse, but it carried, "The girl is alive. Owen Ashby knew how to live inside stone. His daughter knows it too." He looked around the room at the assembled faces, the men who had signed the deed, the men who had built the structures that were now failing them, the men who had coined the name Ashby's Folly. "I have seen what she built. A pause that occupied the room completely. "I'm going up. Bowman, are you coming?" Ezra Bowman was already moving toward the door. The journey up the slope took longer than it had ever taken. The snow was chest deep on the lower section of the path, and they had to break through it with their bodies moving, with the slow, deliberate force of men who have committed to a direction and cannot afford to reconsider. Ezra was younger, stronger, driven by the image of his son's face, the shallow breathing, the flush of fever against the cold Helen's expression across the room at the woodpile. He fell twice. The second time, his legs refused the instruction to stand the cold, having worked its way through the insulation of effort into the deeper tissue, and he lay in the snow looking up at a blue sky and felt the seductive logic of stillness. Walt's hand closed around his coat collar. The old man's strength was the strength of men who have spent their lives doing hard things in confined spaces. Not dramatic strength, not the strength of effort, but the durable strength of sustained work. The kind that persists when the surface resources are gone because it is built into the structure of the person rather than drawn from reserves. He hauled Ezra upright without ceremony. "Not yet," he said. The same two words he had clearly said before to other men in other dark places, the words he kept available for exactly this use. They moved on. The slope was steeper in the deep snow, each step a negotiation with gravity. Then Ezra saw it. Above the snowpack, barely visible, a thin shimmer in the cold air. Heat rising from the chimney stack, not smoke, not the black column of a fire burning wastefully, but a nearly transparent thread of warmth meeting the frozen air above it, a ghost rising from the earth to confirm that something below was alive. Behind it, the wooden front wall of the cave, the small window glowing amber. Ezra raised his hand, knocked. The door opened inward and the warmth came out to meet them. It arrived not as a blast, but as a presence. The cave's stored warmth accumulated over months of steady, careful management, releasing itself into the cold air of the doorway, with the patient generosity of something that has been building toward this moment without knowing it. Not the sharp heat of an open fire, not the dry metallic warmth of a stove at maximum output, something that had no precise equivalent in any structure either of them had ever entered, because it came from everywhere simultaneously, from the floor beneath their boots, from the rock walls on both sides, from the air itself, which had been kept at a steady temperature for so long it had forgotten how to be otherwise. Maren stood in the doorway in her wool dress, no coat, no shawl. Her hands were smooth. Ezra stepped inside. He moved to the center of the space and turned slowly the way a man turns when his senses are reporting something his understanding cannot immediately process. He removed his gloves. His fingers were white stiff, the early stages of cold injury that would resolve with warmth or worsen without it. He extended his hand toward the rock wall beside him. He pressed his palm flat against the stone and held it there. The warmth that came back through his hand was deep structural, the warmth of something that had been storing heat for months rather than hours. Not surface warmth, not the warmth of a sun-warmed rock that will be cold again by evening. The warmth of the earth's own patience, the warmth of a system designed to hold what it is given and give it back slowly over time without waste. He held his hand against the stone for a long time. His chest moved with his breathing. His eyes did not move from the wall. Ezra Bowman had been building shelters since he was 22 years old. He had built them with the genuine conviction that he understood what shelters were and what they needed to do. He had built them for people he cared about in a community he had served with real craftsmanship to standards that had served well through 11 previous winters. What his hand was telling him now was that he had been building boxes, well-made boxes, carefully jointed, structurally sound boxes that let heat out and invited cold in through every thermal bridge his craft had never thought to account for, because his craft had learned from other boxes and had never thought to learn from anything else. A 17-year-old girl who had never built anything in her life had looked at a hole in the ground and understood something about warmth that 30 years of professional construction had not taught him. Walt had found his corner. He was sitting on the warm floor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, and his face had the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to arrive. His lips moved slightly. "Edwin." He stopped, started again, correcting himself. "Owen." A pause. "You would have loved this." Ezra turned to Maren. The words he needed were somewhere behind the barrier of everything he was feeling simultaneously. The relief, the exhaustion, the professional shame, the father's desperation that had propelled him up the slope. They didn't come in the order he wanted them. "My boy is sick," he said, We have no more wood." Maren looked at this man who had walked up her hill with Douglas fir and pity, who had told her she was building a death trap, who had shaken his head on his way back down the slope, like a man leaving something he had already mourned. She did not experience his arrival as vindication. She experienced it as what it was: a man who had built his life on a set of beliefs that had just been tested and found incomplete, standing in the evidence of that incompleteness, with his sick child's image in his eyes. "Bring your family," she said. "There is room." She loaded her sled with wood from the supply that had cost her 6 weeks of impossible labor, enough to heat the Bowman cabin for the journey, enough to keep the cold from the children during the transit. Ezra took the sled rope. He turned toward the door. He stopped without turning around, his voice addressed to the closed wooden wall in front of him. "You were right about all of it." Then he walked back into the snow. The Bowman family arrived as the afternoon light went flat. Helen came through the door, holding Nell against her hip and guiding James with her other hand, the boy barely conscious, his small face flushed with the particular brightness of a fever that has been running a long time against difficult conditions. Helen's eyes went to Maren first, then to the cave itself, the warmth hitting her in the doorway the same way it had hit Ezra, not just physically but in some deeper way, in the part of a person that registers safety at a level below thought. She set Nell down. She put her arms around Maren and held on with the fierceness of a woman expressing something for which she has no words. Something that encompasses gratitude, but is larger than that: the embrace of a person who has survived something terrible while thinking of someone else and has just been given a moment to feel the survival. Hilda was already at the firebox heating water. She knelt beside James when they laid him on the cot near the firebox, and she placed her hand on his forehead with a touch that was practiced diagnostic, the touch of a woman who had spent 9 years monitoring Owen's health by hand when there was no doctor available, who had learned through necessity the information that a temperature communicates through the palm. She wrung cloths in the hot water, placed them on the boy's chest, replaced them when they cooled. She sang, not loudly, not performing, but the soft, automatic singing of a woman whose hands are occupied with something important. A Moravian lullaby she had learned before she learned English, the melody her mother had sung to her in the Pennsylvania settlement where she had grown up, the melody she had sung to Maren through every fever of her childhood. James stopped moving. The fighting quality of his body, the unconscious resistance of a sick child against discomfort, eased. His hand reached up and found the edge of the warm cloth on his chest and held it. His breathing slowed into the rhythm of a body that has been given permission to rest. Helen sat across from Hilda, watching the woman the town had written off, the sick widow. The foreign woman, the one who would be first to die in the cave work, with the quiet competence of someone who has been doing this for 20 years. At some point during the long evening, Helen reached across and took Hilda's free hand. Hilda did not stop singing. She held Helen's hand and smoothed James's hair and sang the old words, the Moravian words from the settlement 2 decades behind her. The words that carried everything her mother had given her across a distance and a time that had seemed until this moment entirely uncrossable. Their eyes met. The language between them was not German or English. It was the language of mother's ancient precise, requiring no translation. 2 more families came that day, guided up the slope by Ezra, who made the trip 3 times through the deep snow, breaking the path wider each time. The cave held 14 people by the second night. It was crowded. It was uncomfortable in the specific ways that shared survival is uncomfortable: the shortage of private space, the negotiation of routine in a room full of people with different routines. The floor was warm. The air was clean. Every person who stepped through the door experienced the same quiet revolution, the same displacement of a lifelong assumption about what warmth required and where it came from. Maren managed the system through it all, feeding the firebox every few hours. With the measured additions, the equilibrium required no more. The thermal mass did the rest. 14 people sleeping on a warm floor produced their own supplementary heat, reducing the fuel demand further. The cave designed for 2 held 14, with its air remaining clean because Owen had calculated the ventilation for exactly this kind of contingency, not because he had foreseen this specific night, but because he had understood that the principles he was designing into the system extended beyond any single use he could anticipate. Clem Rigby appeared on the 3rd day. He came alone without announcement through the broken path that Ezra had packed down over multiple trips. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a different person from the one who had leaned against his father's porch post, watching them walk away, different from the one who had stood in the dark over a destroyed chimney stack with a bottle in his hand. That person had been assembled from pride and injury and the mistaken belief that they were the same thing. What stood in the doorway now was what remained when those materials are removed by cold hunger, the sound of a father's wet cough and 72 hours of sitting with what you have done. The room went quiet. Several people present had heard what Clem had said about the cave. A few had suspicions that went further. The silence had the quality of a verdict being formed. Maren looked at him for a long time. She read his face with the attention Owen had taught her to give rock faces, not the surface which tells you only what it wants to, but the structure beneath the stress patterns, the history written in compression and fracture. She saw the boy who had been 9 years old in a house where grief was not permitted. She saw the 20 years of performing usefulness in place of receiving love. She saw the specific loneliness of a person who has confused being needed with being known, who has spent their whole life in the gap between those two things without ever finding the words for the gap itself. She stepped to one side and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Is your father all right?" Clem's mouth opened. He stepped inside. His feet met the warm floor and his legs gave way with the simple honesty of a body that has been holding something up for a long time and has just been given permission to stop. He sat down against the wall, his back against the rock, his shoulders working with the soundless heaving of a person weeping in the way people weep when they have forgotten how, not dramatically, not seeking witness, just the involuntary release of a structure under too much sustained pressure. Helen Bowman's eyes went to his boots. She had seen the tread pattern before pressed into the soft earth beside a demolished chimney stack on a November morning. She looked at Maren. Maren shook her head, one small movement, almost invisible. Helen understood. There are debts that cannot be paid through confession, that can only be paid through the slow labor of becoming different from what you were. The testimony was in the arriving. The reckoning would be in what came after. When Clem could speak, Maren said, "Tomorrow morning go back for your father. I'll give you wood for the trip." "Why?" The word came out rough, genuinely confused, the question of a person who has not been given things without cost, often enough to recognize the transaction when it occurs. "Because you are cold," Maren said. The simplicity of it was not cruelty. It was the most complete answer available. "You are cold. I have warmth. The rest is not complicated." Clem left at first light, pulling the loaded sled down the broken path toward Ashvale Gulch. The journey to the store and back took 4 hours. He fell in the deep sections and got up. He fell again and got up again. He reached his father, wrapped him in every blanket the store contained, loaded him onto the sled, pulled him back up the slope through snow that reached his chest for the full upper third of the climb. When he came through the door of the cave, his hands were bleeding inside his gloves, and his face held the particular expression of someone who has just completed the first honest thing they have ever chosen to do without being asked. Walt Purdy waited until the second evening, when most of the cave's occupants were asleep, to place the stone on the table. It was small enough to close a fist around red sandstone, with dark shale veining, the same geological composite as the flue stones in the cave walls. But the surface of it was wrong for stone too smooth worn to a polish, that no natural process produces the smoothness of an object handled repeatedly over many years, turned in a pocket, rubbed between thumb and finger in the dark of underground spaces, carried as a talisman carries whatever the carrier needs it to carry. Maren picked it up. Walt's voice was the voice of a man spending words with care. "Owen gave that to me the week before the shaft collapsed. Said to hold on to it, said it was the future." He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were the eyes of someone who has been keeping something for a long time and is finally delivering it to the right address. "I didn't know what he meant then." A pause that held the weight of 2 years of carrying. "I do now." Maren held the stone. It was warm from Walt's pocket, the warmth of a human body's constant temperature, and it would stay warm from her hand for a long time after she set it down. That was the nature of the material retention slow release, the willingness to hold what it has been given. Owen had understood this about stone before he understood anything else about it, before he understood the thermal calculations, or the flue angles, or the ventilation mathematics. He had understood that the earth remembers. "He couldn't come to us directly," Walt said. "Stoke was contesting the boundary on my cabin, a dispute that had been running for 2 years. If I publicly took your side, he had grounds to accelerate the action. The tools were all I could leave. The chalk mark." He looked at the stone in her hand. "I'm sorry it wasn't more." Maren closed her fingers around the stone. The warmth inside her palm and the warmth of the stone reached an equilibrium that was indistinguishable from each other. It was enough, she said. She meant it with the precision of a person stating an engineering fact. The information had been sufficient. The system had worked. Her father had known it would. Spring came late that year, as it always does after a winter that has given everything it has. The snow retreated without grace, leaving behind a landscape that looked scoured the erosion of the temporary, the land returning to itself after months of occupation. Ashevale Gulch emerged from the winter changed in ways that the residents would spend years articulating and never fully exhaust. Judge Stoke came in late March, on foot, hat in his hands. He placed a document on the table and nodded to Maren and to Hilda, and left without staying for any conversation that might have complicated what the document said. It was a deed. 10 additional acres surrounding the notch granted free of encumbrance, with a notation in the margin in Stoke's own handwriting, with the gratitude of the board. It was not an apology. It was the closest Harlan Stoke's nature permitted him to come to one, and Maren accepted it as she accepted most things that arrived from the direction of power quietly without ceremony, without incurring the debt that gratitude requires. Through the spring, unmarked crates appeared at intervals on the ledge outside the cave door. Wire, nails, a bag of good mortar, lumber in useful lengths. Inventory from Rigby's general store delivered without invoice, without note, without any communication that would require acknowledgement in return. Maren used everything. She made no comment. The exchange happened in a dialect that required no words restitution, in the language of someone who does not know how to say the words but understands the grammar of action. Clem Rigby ran his father's store with an attention to detail that the elder Rigby, watching from his chair in the corner where he spent most of his days, now recognized as exceeding his own. The shelves were organized with a care that went beyond efficiency into something closer to devotion. He extended credit to people his father had turned away. He remembered the names of children. He had learned at some cost the difference between arranging your life to be needed and simply being useful. The difference being that usefulness asks nothing of the person it serves, requires no acknowledgement, produces no debt. Ezra Bowman came to the cave on an evening in April with a roll of drafting paper under his arm. He sat at the small table Maren had built from scrap wood, and he drew. Not the structures he already knew, he drew those in his sleep, could build them from memory. He drew something he had been thinking about since the morning in January, when his palm had communicated to him through the medium of warm stone what his eyes had failed to show him through 30 years of looking at the world's surface. The drawing showed a wooden frame correctly proportioned, joined with the precision of his craft. Beneath the floor, rendered in careful cross-section, ran a flue-long horizontal stone line. The chimney stack rose at a distance from the main structure, connected by the underground passage that carried the heat where it needed to go. Maren studied it. She reached across and adjusted a line, tilting the flue path to account for the grade of the hypothetical building site. He had sketched the 2-degree slope that water required the drainage channel along the low side. Ezra looked at her correction. He nodded. She nodded. It was not her design or his. It was the design that emerges when two different ways of understanding the same problem find the place where they agree. His knowledge of wood and load and joint, her knowledge of thermal mass and draw and grade combined into something neither could have arrived at alone. They called it the Maren hearth. The name attached itself naturally, the way names attach to things that need to be remembered, not through decree but through repetition, through the fact that people who had experienced it wanted a way to refer to it when they built it elsewhere. And her name was the most accurate available shorthand for everything the system contained. The method spread through Nevada territory over the following years, carried by the practical testimony of people who had wintered in Ashevale Gulch and returned to their own communities with specific knowledge. Other builders learned it, adapted it, improved the chimney stack design, refined the clay mixture for different soil compositions. The basic principle remained Owen's: the earth is not the enemy of warmth, but its most patient ally. And Maren's patience requires a system, a channel, a 40-foot argument with gravity that the gravity eventually loses. Walt Purdy came to the cave every afternoon. He sat in his corner on the warm floor, drank tea, contributed to conversations occasionally, but did not require them. He and Maren spent some of those afternoons with Owen's journal open between them, turning the pages with the care of people handling something that has served its most important purpose and must now be treated accordingly. He told her things about Owen that the journal didn't contain, stories from the mine, the particular quality of his attention when he was working out a problem, the way he would go quiet for an hour, and then produce an answer that had taken nobody else's mind in that direction. Walt had loved Owen Ashby with the loyalty that men who work underground together develop, which is different from other kinds of loyalty because it is tested daily in conditions that make pretense too expensive to maintain. He died on a Tuesday in September 3 years later in his chair in the corner with his teacup still warm. Hilda found him. She said he looked peaceful, which was true. She said he looked like he was sleeping, which was also true. He looked like a man who had finished something he had been waiting to finish, and had found on the other side of the finishing that rest was finally possible. Maren buried him on the hillside above the cave. She carried a large piece of red sandstone up the slope and set it at the head of the grave, working it into the earth until it stood level and stable. She did not carve his name on it. The stone was from the same formation as the flue stones, the same geological composite Owen had cataloged and Walt had carried as a talisman for 2 years in a dark pocket. It marked the place. It would outlast the marking. Walt Purdy would have understood this completely. Hilda lived to 78. The years that Croft had told Maren she would not have the years, the cold and the smoke and the damaged tissue would have taken came back to her one by one. Over the following decades returned by the warm, dry, clean air of the cave. The way a debt is returned in installments without fanfare, with the quiet consistency of something that has simply decided to make good on what it owes. She watched her daughter become the person that the valley turned to, not because Maren sought authority, but because she had demonstrated something that authority cannot confer and cannot revoke: the understanding of how to survive, extended outward into the understanding of how to help others do the same. Hilda died in her bed in the cave on a morning in late autumn, the stone floor warm beneath her as it had been warm every morning of the past decades. Maren held her hands. Hilda's last words were in the Moravian German of the Pennsylvania settlement, where she had grown up, a phrase from the lullaby she had sung to James Bowman on the first night of the blizzard. Maren did not speak the language fluently, but she knew the phrase. She had heard it all her life, had heard it most clearly in those 3 suspended days in January, when the storm raged against the mountain and failed to enter when the cave was warm and the world outside was not. It meant sleep. Now the cold cannot find you here. Years later, a traveler passing through Asheville Gulch stopped at Rigby's general store for supplies and conversation, and was told when he asked about the unusual homes built into the hillsides to look in the town records. He found the leather-bound journal there shelved between the survey maps and the mining claim registrations. He sat at the reading table and turned the pages carefully, following Owen Ashby's precise handwriting through 11 years of geological observation and thermal calculation, through the diagrams that had become the basis of a building method practiced now across 3 territories. On the final page, at the end of all the calculation and observation, below all the diagrams and notations and the mathematics of heat and stone and time, Owen had written a single sentence, not addressed to anyone, not signed, simply placed there the way you place a tool down when the work is done with care, in a spot where it can be found by whoever needs it next. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs the sun and remembers its warmth. Be the mountain. The traveler sat for a moment with the journal closed in his hands, feeling through the soles of his boots, the gentle warmth rising from the stone floor of the building, the Maren hearth beneath him, charging the ground with energy that would radiate back through the night, long after anyone present had stopped thinking about it. He set the journal down with the care it deserved. He stood. He walked outside. On the hillside north of the main street, barely visible against the blue of the late afternoon sky, a thin thread of warmth rose from a small stone column. In the window of a door set into the rock face above it, a light burned steady amber, the specific quality of light that comes from a space that is warm, because the earth beneath it remembers what warmth is. The mountain remembered. It had been remembering for a long time. It would go on remembering long after the names of everyone present had passed beyond the reach of any living memory, because that is the nature of stone, which is patient, where people are urgent, which holds what it has been given without being asked, which returns warmth to the cold, not because it has been instructed to, but because that is what stone does when it has been trusted with heat. Someone was home.